Hey, you're listening to Resilience Radio, episode 20 on death. Who am I? I'm Irvin Eisenberg, owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy and host at Resilience Radio. The opinions on this show are not necessarily shared by me. I like to showcase a variety of different perspectives, and everyone has different needs and gets different things out of different episodes. Additionally, none of this is meant to be medically diagnostic or prescriptive in any way. Today's guest is Michelle Acciavatti. It's good to have you on, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
So, usually I introduce guests a little bit beforehand, but I thought that the way we first met was quite interesting. We were at a dinner party, and I sort of did the casual conversation of, well, what line of work are you in, or what do you do? And you just gave the single word response of death. And I thought that instead of introducing you today, I would let you elaborate on what it is you do.
It's funny that you remember that. I use that as sort of a way to gauge how in depth to go into what I do. If people just run away after I say death, I know it's like, okay, well, that wasn't going to be a good conversation. But you stayed interested and engaged, and sort of expand on that. Yeah, I've built myself basically a career working in death. Sort of I'm a licensed funeral director in the state of Vermont. I'm also an end of life specialist. And so that includes a lot of things. I've trained and worked as an end of life doula, which is a bit like a birth doula, only you're guiding a person and their loved ones through the end of life process. So you don't have a new life at the end of it. Only in the metaphorical sense, you have a new life at the end of it, which is a life without the person that has died. I'm a home funeral guide, so I educate families about how to care for their own dead loved ones, either in the home or in some sort of bridged setting. Maybe it's in a funeral home or someone else's home. But that's something that a lot of people don't even know that they have the right to do in Vermont, which is to act as their own funeral director, take custody of the body, and do all the body care themselves and arrange for disposition. I'm also a green burial educator and advocate, so I help people make choices about what that disposition is going to look like. Was it going to be a conventional burial? Is it going to be cremation? 80% of people in Vermont choose cremation right now. And I'd really like to encourage people to start thinking about green burial, which didn't become fully legal as an option until 2017. And I work with people who are experiencing coming to the end of life at all stages. So especially one thing that I specialize in is death during pregnancy, which can be very difficult because you don't even have a chance to say hello and to honor a life beyond what you imagined for a person before the death occurs. I do this work mainly through two organizations that I've started. One is Ending Well, which is my own business, which is sort of where I provide support to families as a funeral director, as an end of life specialist, as a home funeral guide, kind of however they need me. And I also work with people who are interested in doing similar things. So people who are looking for mentorship or guidance can come to me for that. I also have started recently a project to create a natural burial ground here in central Vermont. That's called Vermont Natural Burial. So that's in the process of getting up off the ground, and that's going to create a cemetery that is completely dedicated to natural burial and will be a space where people can create land-based ceremonies and rituals for saying goodbye to their loved ones. And we can get into more detail about kind of what that means and why I think that's so important. And then I work with two other organizations. I'm on the board of the National Home Funeral Alliance, and I chair their Equity and Access Committee. So looking at the home funeral model and looking at what does it really mean to have a home funeral? Does it need to look like a funeral? Does it need to take place in homes? There are so many cultures that practice hands-on death care that don't turn it over to a funeral director. And how do we look at what does that mean in today's sort of modern world, where it used to be that everybody cared for their own dead, but for large portions of the cultures in the US, especially the middle and upper class white Americans chose to, or didn't choose to, just sort of went with the flow of death care becoming professionalized. And so they no longer care for their own dead and are seeking to reconnect with those skills. And then the other organization, I was a co-founder and a board member, and now work on a committee for the Collective for Radical Death Studies, which is a similar idea of looking at how do we construct a new model of death studies, of approaching and thinking about death that centers marginalized voices. And we sort of break down the colonial model that has sort of become the overwhelming narrative when we talk about death, even when we talk about alternative death care.
Hmm. Wow, that's a that's a lot.
That's it.
That's a lot
It's
you
a
do.
lot. You
So
can see why I try to gauge people's reactions when I start talking about what I do.
yeah, there's a lot of avenues you can go, and we'll go down some of those today.
Yeah.
Um, could you speak for a moment before we get into those a little bit more about your what are your credentials, or more so than your credentials, what's your story? What got you into death?
It's my origin story. So there's a couple different places where I think that this really starts. There's one moment, and it's so funny because one time somebody said it's not like you just wake up one day and decide to do this, and that's almost literally what happened. But there's a couple things that happened before that that led me into that, and so one is when my mother's mother was dying. My mother was incredibly present through her dying process. I was a sophomore in college, and I came home. Um, for winter break. My grandmother died just before Christmas, and I was with my mother. And that was the first time that I'd really seen an example of what we would really call vigiling and spending time with a body. I mean, my mom was just very attentive and at the bedside. Her mother was really ready to die, did not want to be treated for underlying health conditions. And so that was a real lesson to me and what it means to be present, to not try to fix what's going on at the end of life, to just be there with support and love. So that's something that really sort of stuck with me. And then when I was a senior in college, my two of my best friends died very suddenly in accidents. And I remember sitting there at graduation, and sort of things that they say when you graduate from college, it's just you can go on and you can be anything. And one of those things is dead. Was something that I really distinctly remember thinking. And so there was just sort of an underlying consciousness of the fact that I was mortal, a mortal being with a finite time. And that really came to a head for me. So I originally set out to do an MD PhD. I was going to work with preemies, so working with infants that were born early. I was interested in the relationship between motor development and cognitive development. And so I started to get a degree in neuroscience. It turns out that I am not at all cut out to get an MD PhD. That's not what I want to do. I want to work with people. It took me a little while to figure that out, but I bailed, so I have a master's from that work. But I ended up building this fantastic relationship with Boston Children's Hospital. And I went to work for them as a consultant for the Office of Ethics. And so I was there really as a bit of a research assistant. Office of Ethics at Children's Hospital handles anything that comes up where somebody's concerned about care. But a lot of it, as you can imagine, has to do with end of life care. And when we make decisions about, or when a family needs to make a decision about continuing life sustaining treatment, choosing that next surgery, whatever that may be. And those are some particularly difficult decisions. And a lot of those have to do, ironically enough, with the NICU. So we're dealing with very premature infants, or infants that were born early and were born with many health problems, and also neurological issues and accidents, or issues, also neurological issues, things that arose either as the result of an accident or some kind of trauma. And that was the day I woke up and decided, no, what I really want to do is I want to work in death, is because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who is a fantastic woman. She's an herbalist, a birth doula, and a birth midwife. And I was talking to her about families that had made the decision to forego life sustaining treatment. So they were now going to be with their child who was dying. And this is Boston Children's Hospital. By any measure, it's one of the best hospitals in the world. And they do so much in terms of offering support to families. Any religion that you can possibly imagine, or spiritual practice, they'll have somebody there to support families. No matter what someone's native language is, they'll have an interpreter there to make sure that they're hearing things in their own tongue, and from their own cultural perspectives. Making sure that doctors aren't seen as people that are coming in to fix things, but are a part of a system that makes sense to that family. And they have incredibly well-trained social workers and just teams of people. And yet it just really felt like something was really missing from that experience. And so that was 2013. And that was really what set me off on this journey of what is missing. And that's what led into kind of all of the things that I do now are ways to address those things that are missing in the more medical model of death and dying.
So what is the just to get a little bit of perspective here, what is the funeral home director That's a Vermont license. What's the typical path for a funeral home director? Just to give a little bit of contrast here.
So I think most people that go into funeral directing are people that really care about helping families through those decisions that happen after death. They feel that they can be present, they can feel like they can offer practical advice, and they have a lot of compassion and understanding for this bewildering experience of somebody's died and now you have to make a whole bunch of decisions. And despite the advances we've made with advanced directives, a lot of people don't include their funeral wishes in advanced directives. And of course, here in Vermont, we're a rather stoic community. We don't talk a lot about what our wishes may be. And so a lot of times families are really looking for support and guidance. And so I think kind of a more traditional funeral director is somebody that wants to be that guide of helping families through that process. And I think that's beautiful and that's wonderful. For me, it's more about facilitating that process. When a family comes to me, and this is sort of the very common thing, one of the early things that get said in a conversation when I meet a family is we have no idea what to do. And this is where I think the doula model of care that I've trained in for end of life really serves me in how I present and show up as a funeral director, which is, that's really okay. There's no reason you should know what to do or how to feel, and to really work with them about kind of beginning to take that apart and to build something that is, well, what do you know? What do you know about the person that died? What mattered to them? What matters to you? You're the ones that are mourning. What's going to meet your needs? And we start to have this conversation where together we build something instead of me throwing options out at them, and they kind of pick which option is best suited to them. We really build something from the ground up. So that funeral director title, I think, definitely carries a certain connotation, certainly of, embalming and church funerals and traditional pathways and things. And that's something that I've tried to honor, because that's certainly an expectation that some people have of their funeral director. But it's also something that I've tried to bring my own way of being with families into doing.
So, in your own work, are you currently doing funeral directing in the more traditional sense, or what's the nitty-gritty of your own work look like?
So the nitty gritty of my own work at this moment in time is I'm not currently working in a conventional funeral home. I did that. I learned a lot. It was an incredible experience. I met wonderful families and I learned so much from them. I am in the process of finishing up. This is not required for your Vermont funeral director's license, but I'm finishing mortuary school, which is a 2-year program. And I'll sit the board exams, which will allow me to be licensed in any other state as well. So I took a break from the funeral home to really focus on prepping for boards. I still don't quite know what that's going to look like in the middle of a pandemic, if I'm actually going to be able to take them, because it involves going to a testing center. But no, I think that I got what I needed, in addition to needing time to prepare for boards, but I got what I needed out of working in a conventional setting. And what I'd really like to do is build a different model of funeral care. So where I really am in a place where people's expectations is that they're going to come to me as less of a funeral director and more of a funeral facilitator. That it's going to involve facilitating mainly green burials, natural burial, and creating ceremonies around disposition in the same way that I've been working with families from the beginning, which is, what really matters, what matters to you, what meets your needs as mourners. And that's been something that's been particularly interesting to have the chance to practice and work on during a pandemic, when it's been so limited. We think an awful lot about sort of the social aspect of funerals, getting together, hearing from everybody that knew the person that died, even if the people that are arranging the funeral don't know these people that come. They hear these stories. We celebrate life in this way. What does it mean when we take away that ability to gather in large numbers? And I've fought really hard against the idea that, well, we just move it online. We have the funeral on Zoom, so we still have hundreds of people there or so, and everybody's telling their story. And it's like, no, like, how do we really drill down? And again, so something that I'm going to say over and over again, how do we get down to what is it that the family needs in this moment? Hopefully when the pandemic has passed, we can still have these large celebrations where many, many stories are shared. But how do we really bring into decisions about disposition and ceremony and ritual and remembering the people that have died when you have restrictions on gathering, when you have restrictions on touch. Um, and so that's been something that's been very interesting for me to begin to work with families to get them to think about what is it that they need, what do they need remembered about the person that has died, and what tools are out there, how do we get really creative about making sure those needs are met.
So it sounds like people are in such a vulnerable state when they're dealing with death. And a lot of people like to fall back on rituals and sort of traditional models in which so they don't have to think about what to do. So I'll just do whatever the funeral home tells me to do because I can't manage this right now. It's a serious thing to be managing. Um, it sounds like you try to unpack more what's the sort of core need that needs to be met right now versus how do we get through the funeral as like another task
Right.
that the grieving family has to deal with. Um,
And I want to say that the rituals, especially some of the more traditional religious rituals or cultural rituals, they exist for a reason because it is really difficult. And one of those things that they do is they create time periods, right? Over this period of time, we're going to be doing these things. We're going to gather in this way. Perhaps we're going to say these prayers. 3 days after, we're going to do this thing. There's an expectation and there's a timeline that I think is really, really helpful to have that structure. So what I do doesn't mean that we're going to throw all that out. If that is something that's valuable both to the person that has died and to the people that are making these decisions, I want to find ways to continue to weave those elements in. But there's this great researcher, Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who's done some work, and he's talked about the needs of mourning. And there's some very, very basic things that are consistent across culture, across religion, really, which are to be seen and to be heard and to be held in that grief process. And this is something that, for a lot of white Americans, we're still kind of puritanical about grief. Excessive displays of emotion are sort of frowned upon. Asking for help is something that a lot of us really aren't very good at, especially when it's around, well, I'm really feeling very sad and I don't know how to articulate what I need right now. Showing up for people that are grieving is really hard. And so again, there are some things that are culturally ingrained that have developed over, the hundreds and thousands of years of religion and culture throughout the world that can be helpful. But what does it look like to kind of strip that down and ask somebody to show up for somebody that they're not going to be able to hug? What does it mean to ask somebody that is not used to asking for support to maybe put a line in the obituary that says, can everybody say, maybe it's a prayer at 5 o'clock on Saturday, evening, or at sunset, can everybody raise a toast in memory of this person? Or my baby never got a chance to live, but his name would have been, can everybody say his name when they talk to me about my dead baby? These are things that I try to work with families without being prescriptive in any way, just if that's something that's going to be helpful for them, help them connect to what's going to be helpful to them.
mm-hmm. So you've made reference before to me the idea of the medical model in terms of death, and that's something that you don't necessarily follow. Could you define the medical model and then what it is? Or is that just another way of saying what you've already been talking about?
I mean, I think I can define what it means for me. That's a term that it's definitely out there, and I think that in a lot of ways, medicalized dying is the norm of how we die right now. Not necessarily right now during a pandemic, but I just mean where we are, which is to say that people tend to receive a lot of medical support and care, and often die in hospital with a lot of machinery, and so things that help them breathe, tools that help them eat if they can no longer take food by mouth, medication to help them stay as lucid as possible for as long as possible. And it's not something that I have necessarily an issue with. Where I come from is an issue of informed consent. So if somebody's struggling to breathe because they're dying because their lungs no longer work, what does it mean to really have a honest conversation about, yes, you can go receive hospital support and you can be put on a ventilator, and that ventilator is going to put oxygen into your lungs, but at a certain point in time, your lungs are no longer going to be able to do what they do, which is to get that oxygen to all the organs in the rest of your body, whether you're on a machine or not. And so kind of the opposite, and what I encourage people to think about is, what would it look like to stay home and receive support again? So, it's not an anti-medical model where there's drugs and therapies that can be used to ease that sense of not being able to breathe, to help relax the airways, to help people feel more relaxed and more calm through that process of not being able to breathe, that their family members can get used to not panicking when somebody's struggling to breathe. But the idea is sort of that when we're at the end of life, when what interventions are simply doing are prolonging the inevitable, what has value to people? And there are many people where what has value is the maximum amount of time, even if they're on a ventilator and they can't speak. And what has value to other people is to make that, and it's incredibly difficult. We're not trained to think about ourselves as mortal beings who are going to die, but to kind of come into relationship with the fact that this is it, my lungs can no longer sustain me. I'm going to go home and I'm going to be comfortable, but I might be able to have more conversations. I'm going to be in a familiar setting. And so really, for me, when I talk about alternatives to the medical model, I really want it to be values based. I don't want to think so much about the treatments as opposed to what does it mean to the person that's receiving the treatment and their loved ones. And what does it mean in terms of their quality of life and their quality of dying.
I'm thinking about the first death that I was honored to be able to witness, a death of my uncle, and he was affluent enough and had a doctor son and a doctor daughter-in-law, and had the hospital bed in at home and oxygen set up and everything, and it was really a beautiful um, it was really a beautiful event watching his family there and him being able to be sent off in the way that he wanted, in the way that the family wanted. Um, when I look at that and I hear what you're saying, one of the things I wonder is, how is this affordable for people? How is this manageable for someone who isn't in the one sample case study that I have to draw from? How else can this look?
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, the accessibility of this, the equity of access to these types of options. In theory, hospice is paid for by Medicare. So everybody should be able to get what they need at home in terms of whether it's supplementary oxygen or a hospital bed. They have nurses and social workers that are going to come in and visit you at home. Um, Even people that have families that aren't well versed at all in medical care, or maybe even have a deep and well earned distrust of the medical system, should be able to receive care and support that will allow them to feel comfortable caring for somebody at home. The reality is very different. These funds are limited. There isn't somebody there 24/7. The family is still, and I use family very loosely. I don't necessarily mean blood relatives. What I'm talking about is the people that are there that are doing the caring. And a lot of times that's friends or community members, or, and sometimes it's blood relatives, but it's different for everybody. I just use family because it's a nice catch-all for that. So the burden of care really does lie on the family. And this is where I think, again, the end of life doula model can be helpful, because then at least you have somebody coming in that can at least help you kind of adjust to, this is normal. This is the question that I get most often when I'm at the bedside of somebody that's dying. Is this normal? Is this change in their breathing normal? Is the fact that they're so thirsty normal? Is the fact that they seem to be talking to people that we can't see, or people that have died? Is this normal? Is this in that reassurance of like, yes, and yes, you can do this. But the fact of the matter is that the expectation is that you will be able to provide some form of 24-hour care. In private nursing, hiring private nursing care to supplement what a family can provide is really difficult. The majority of families in the US are scattered. So that means traveling to be at the bedside. It means taking time off work. The majority of families in the United States are still two families, or both people and families are working. We still see gender breakdowns where it's a lot of times it's the women, the wives that are and daughters that are called back to sacrifice the most in order to do care. And so this model that I'm talking about of being able to die at home has a lot of flaws and expectations. It's also very difficult because dying is messy. It really is. And I don't even mean sort of like the biological functions that break down and the fact that somebody might need help with toileting themselves or being fed. There's neurological things that happen. That experience of seeing and speaking to people who aren't there, perhaps dead relatives or dead friends, isn't always pleasant. It can be alarming, both for the person dying and for the family. People experience what is sort of loosely termed terminal agitation, where people won't stay in bed. They get up and they are fall risk, and they can actually really hurt themselves. We talk about people who are dying of dementia, which is a very common thing these days, who you can't leave alone. I'm familiar with a very sad story of a woman who had a wonderful, loving family who was doing so much care for her, and she somehow still managed to get out of the house in the middle of the night in the winter. And so the fact of the matter is when we talk about an alternative to the medical model of care, we're expecting there to be a level of support between the family and the community and whatever hospice services are available through the state that's going to allow that to happen at home. And the reality is, assuming that someone even has a home, the reality is that is building that support network is really hard. Is just really, really hard. And so that is why I think many people find it easier, find it more comforting. It feels safer to still choose to be in a hospital or some sort of institutional setting at the end of life.
So from a cost standpoint, or at what point to bring you into the picture, what does that look like?
So if you want to hire an end of life doula, right? Is that what we're talking about? That
Yeah.
services or?
Yes, but both the end of life doula services sort of affordability, as well as at what point in the process, who should be contacting you?
Preferably anybody the second that they turn 18 and can start thinking about this. I would love, I honestly would, I would love to start teaching in high schools and talking about end of life. The fact that we assume that teenagers, especially older teenagers, first of all, haven't experienced a loss is absurd to me, but also aren't ready to start thinking about themselves as mortal beings is absurd to me. And this probably goes back a little bit to my experiences with loss when I was young. I mean, I was 21, but still, I think that when we start to talk about affordability and access and practicality of all of this, the sooner you start, the better. So if we start thinking about what are the things that we need as we grow and we age? We need food, we need shelter, we need a reliable job if we're lucky, or some way of providing income. We live in a capitalist society, right? In order to buy the things that we need. But we also need community. And one of those reasons that we're going to need community is that for people that choose to have children, it's awfully great to have somebody show up and offer to help you with cleaning or drop off meals or let you get some sleep or take a shower when your baby's at that stage that they can't be left alone. And we need that same community throughout life. We have all these experiences where it becomes very difficult for us to do things on our own. And that's very much a US American value, right? Of individuality and getting it through and autonomy and all of this. But we need help. That's the fact of the matter. We're humans, we're social creatures, and part of being a social creature is needing help. If we're going through a major life transition, if we're moving, asking somebody that has maybe a bigger car than ours to help us get our couch to our new place in life. And that community continues up until the end of life and when we're dying. And some of that help can look like the same way that it does when someone's had a baby, which is somebody that maybe comes in and helps you with the cleaning or make sure that you have food to eat. Or goes to the grocery store for you. But it can also mean people that are willing to sit with somebody who's dying and spend time with them, read to them, tell them stories, remind them of your experiences together and being in community together. And so that's why I think that when it comes to hiring somebody and when should somebody call, the reality, what does it look like right now? Given that I'm not allowed to go in and start, it's not that I'm not allowed, but given that I'm not going into high schools and teaching people and I'm not out there, there's a lot of people that are advocating for community and more communal models of living. And I'd love for them to include death and aging in their conversations about why these communities are so important. But right now, I think it's the same as what a hospice would ask, which is as soon as possible. As soon as you know that someone's going to start facing a decline, call and have a conversation with me. Because one of the things that I do, in addition to actually, being of service and providing support, is helping people craft and create plans. And that can be as practical as creating a schedule of this person can be here from these times to this times. But it also can be sitting down and saying, again, let's get back into values. What's really valuable about this time? Now that we know that it's limited, now that we know that it's coming to an end, what's really important that happens during this time? Is it reading favorite stories, going through photo albums? Maybe there's something that somebody needs to ask forgiveness for or receive absolution. Maybe it's creating something that you have an honest conversation. How do you want to be remembered? Maybe it's putting together all of the recipes for somebody that, they're fed their family with love their entire life. And so we're going to make sure that those recipes live on together. And these are things that people often don't think about. Death is overwhelming. When somebody hears that they're dying, it's traumatic. It's shocking. And to start to think about, yep, this is what's happening. How do we come into relationship with the fact that that's happening? And how do we decide what matters now that this is really and truly happening? And how do we get through this? How do we build community and support? What's available? Where is this going to happen? All of those things are questions that the sooner we can get them answered, the better it is. And honestly, the more cost effective it's going to be down the line.
Okay. As I said, there's a lot to unpack from your original stuff. So I'm going to
Yeah.
backtrack for a moment. And you've mentioned a few times about green burials. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit about what are natural burials, and what those are, and what sort of the legal changes have been in Vermont, and how one could seek those.
Yeah. So the nomenclature when it comes to green burial can get a little bit confusing. So start kind of with a very simple way of thinking about it, which is the way to absolutely minimize the negative environmental impacts of burial and maximize the environmental benefits of burial. So if we think about what are the negative environmental impacts of burial, really what it is we're not returning our bodies, which are sources of nutrients, to the soil. How do we not do that? We embalm them. So part of the embalming process is to actually disrupt the gut biome. So we no longer have bacteria in our gut that partner with the bacteria and other microorganisms in the soil to break our bodies down, mainly into carbon, into nitrogen, and get that distributed back. We actually really don't even put our bodies into contact with the soil anymore. There's generally put a casket into a cement vault that goes into the ground, so there's no contact between the body and the soil. And then we place people in cemeteries which are maintained a bit like golf courses. They're heavily mowed, they're heavily watered, they're heavily fertilized, they're heavily manicured. And so we're not really doing anything with that piece of land. So when we start to think about green burial, we're going to start to take away all of those things. So what does that mean? The first thing is we're not going to do any embalming. We're going to leave the body intact, so that partnership between the body and the soil is intact. And all of those relationships between the bacteria in our own bodies and all the microorganisms in the soil can work to break our bodies down through that process of decomposition. The thing that we're going to do is make sure that the body comes into direct contact with the soil. So the body's going to be in a biodegradable container or shroud that's made out of natural materials. So it can be a woven linen shroud, it can be an old family quilt, it can be a plain pine box, but it's going to be something that's going to break down when it's in the soil, and it's not going to add anything to the soil. So it's a living organism that can do incredible things, but that the soil is not going to be able to break down and also utilize as part of this decomposition process. And then the other thing in making sure that the body comes into contact with the soils, we're going to do away with that vault, that concrete grave liner. And so that in that biodegradable container, whether it's a shroud or a casket that goes directly into the soil. We also need to think about the depth of soil. We want to make sure that the body is high enough up in the soil that's in contact with the active layers, which is the first 10 to 12 inches of soil. It's where the roots come down. That's where the microorganisms live. There's heat from the sun that helps contribute to the decomposition process, and also oxygen, which is really important for this natural aerobic process of decomposition. So when we take all of that and we put a definition to that, what does that mean? It means to be buried without being embalmed, in a biodegradable container and shroud, without an outer burial container. And the last piece of that is in an area that's going to be managed with ecologically sound land management expectations. And so a lot of times what that looks like is doing away with upright monuments for two reasons. One is those need concrete bases, or putting concrete back in the soil, which we don't want to do. But also because it breaks up that space. We can no longer utilize that space as a wild and natural space. There's lanes and rows that are formed by headstones. So that's sort of the four pieces that come together to define what green burial is. One thing that I want to say with that is that when, especially the burial depth piece, what people have a lot of concerns about is animal disturbance. Are we going to be dug up if we're buried? 6 feet under is a common term that's really something that's not accurate, especially here in New England in the winter. If you can ever imagine anybody digging 6 feet, or here in Vermont being able to dig down 6 feet and not running into rock or ledge or water is sort of hard to imagine. It was best we know that came out of plague pits. So during sort of the great waves of the bubonic plague that swept Europe, and when people were dying at numbers that couldn't be handled, they dug giant pits and threw bodies into them. But that's really rarely, if ever, been the case for individual body burial. But when we get back to animal disturbance, so again, soil is a living organism. As it goes through this process of decomposition in partnership with the body, it actually breaks down those elements that create the odors that would attract animals to the grave site. So as long as we have 10 to 14 inches of soil on top of the body, animals aren't going to smell it. They might notice that the soil's been recently disturbed. And in a survey of over 150 natural burial grounds that exist throughout the US and Canada, people did say yes, that oftentimes skunks would come and would nose around because they'd be looking for truffles or things that had been disrupted when the grave itself had been dug. But no one had ever had anything where somebody had been dug up. And that sort of, again, that process of soil creating this both physical and chemical smell barrier where the odors of decomposition aren't reaching the surface. And the other thing is when we think about what we absorb into our bodies during our lives. So heavy metals, just from living around brick, antibiotic treatments that we have, people that have died after cancer and have chemotherapy. There's a lot of concerns about what does it mean to put these chemicals into the soil. And again, soil is a living organism. What soil does is decompose these things. So when we think about decomposition, it is the process of breaking something down into smaller and smaller particles. So it's organic matter. Even chemotherapy drugs and antibiotics and other therapeutic drugs, for the most part, are all made out of organic material. And so the soil can break those down into those components and recycle them back into the ecosystem the same way they're doing with the carbon and the nitrogen and phosphate that makes up our human body. If it's something that it can't break down, if it's an inorganic material, it actually just chelates it and holds it in place. And there have been studies that have been done at forensic research institutes, which are commonly called body farms, that look at how far material travels from where somebody's been buried. And it's about 10 millimeters. So this stuff isn't going very far. It's not getting into the water supply at all. What we do worry about is stuff that breaks down at a faster rate than soil can break it down. And so this is where concrete kind of becomes really the enemy, because concrete breaks down very quickly and concrete leachate can travel very far. And then that's what we worry really about, contaminating water supply. So when that question comes up, is like, we're talking about burying people directly in the soil, no, they're not going to get dug up by animals. No, they're not going to actually contaminate the soil in any way. And that is because soil does this wonderful act of filtering out and breaking down everything and turning everything back into nutrients.
So I'm guessing a lot of people listening to this are wondering, this seems like a lot of work and seems different and weird enough that maybe they're put off by it, even if intrigued. If you're going to do things naturally, why not just do cremation?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I think that that also comes from this idea of cremation as something that is simple, it's straightforward, it's a process that we can understand without needing to think too deeply about. And the issue with cremation is that it requires an awful lot of fossil fuel. It happens at a very, very high temperature. And so that involves fossil fuel. So it happens in a retort or an oven. And if we want to use more plain language for it, we need to heat that oven up to a point where the body is actually going to burn. And then we need to cool it down again. So that's, a lot of fossil fuel that gets used. And it releases a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so that's going to contribute to greenhouse gases. It's also going to release, so when we talk about some of these heavy metals in our body, we can actually release mercury into the air through the cremation process. And the final part about cremation is that because it happens at such a high temperature, what's left, what we call ashes, which are the bone fragments that are left, have had their chemical composition kind of locked into the bone. So that bone still has phosphate, still has calcium in it, but it's happened at such a high temperature that if we were to put that bone directly into the soil wouldn't be able to, through natural processes, actually break that down and get the phosphate and the calcium out of it. The other is because of the very high temperature, they have a pH of about 11.4. So it's incredibly basic, and they're also very salty. So this isn't necessarily something we want to be putting into large amounts into the soil anyways. So that's sort of when we think about cremation, is that yes, it's very simple, it's very affordable, but it's burden on the environment. Remember, we started with that very simple definition of minimizing environmental impacts. Cremation does not in any way minimize the environmental impact of disposition.
Thank you for that clarity. I wanted to talk about something that you had mentioned to me earlier, and you had mentioned that you have a traumatic brain injury, and I'm curious how that's affected your overall approach over the years, and sort of, you mentioned that it has an effect on your work, and I want to hear more about that.
Yeah. So I think that the most positive thing to come out of it was that it taught me to slow down a little bit. You heard me talking about graduating from college and wanting to do an MD, PhD, and all these things, and and that's just not possible when you have a brain like mine, which some days just isn't going to function particularly well. It changed my ability to retain information, and I had to learn whole new ways of learning and retaining information, studying. So it really also began to help me appreciate people with differing abilities. I'd always was somebody that learning came very, very easily to. I didn't, if never had to have any sort of accommodations made for me in school because I had a different learning style, a different way of absorbing information, or I didn't, struggle with retaining information when it was presented just once. And it really helped me understand, now that I am no longer somebody that can do those things, how this world is just not set up to accommodate people that have differing abilities for whatever that reason that is. So I try really hard to think about what matters to me when I'm getting information, when I'm giving information. So I've been really long-winded in these answers here, but when I'm sitting down with the family, I try to break it up. I'm really trying to get a sense of, are they following? What needs clarification? This is work that I've been studying and deeply involved with different teachers and practicing since 2013. It's long enough that I've started to forget what it's like when something is totally new for somebody. So that experience of being able to work one-on-one with people, and that reminder of this is new information for most people that I'm working with, and to gauge, are they getting it? Is this working? Would it help if I offered it in a different way? Do they just need more time to think about it? So that's a really big takeaway from it. It also is really was a bit of a wake-up call in terms of coming into relationship with my own mortality. It came about as a result of a car accident. It was, by all accounts, a very minimal injury. It was just a slight concussion. So, it also, and here it was, I have a degree in neuroscience, and all of a sudden it's like, how does a minor concussion result in, such a traumatic change in my own cognitive ability? So understanding that life changes very quickly. And I think that's part of when I was talking about we need community. We need community throughout our lives. We need to learn to ask for help. That's been something that I've had to struggle with, in terms of learning to ask for help, because certain things are hard now. Because my brain does no longer no, and I've had time. It happened in 2006. I've had time to adjust to how my brain works now, but I do need help, and it does help for me to have a community of people that understand the help that I need, that are willing to show up, and make sure that I am, if I'm having a particularly rough time, that I'm getting fed, or I'm being able to juggle things so that I can show up for the families that are counting on me at a time. Building my own community so that I'm not doing this work solo, so that I have people that can support and step in for me. And the other thing that I think has really come out of it is the idea of values. My traumatic brain injury is this strange nebulous thing where there's not a lot of straightforward treatment. There's some medication that I can take that can help for things, but the rest of it has really been a practice in getting used to having different abilities than I used to have. And part of that has been, okay, so what really matters to me? Because there's a sense of, you can lose your whole sense of self when that happens. And I think that this is parallels to aging, to becoming a parent, to retiring, to divorcing, any major change, we can lose our sense of self. And so we start to think about, okay, but who really am I at the core? Not in terms of what I can do, not in terms of who I'm partnered with, or whether or not I have a child, or whether or not I have a job, but what is it that makes my life worth living? For me, I think about it in terms of what really brings joy to my life. And so that has been a practice that, more than anything, I think I do differently from a lot of people that do advanced care planning work or work with people at end of life, which is to really try to help them kind of have those same sort of thought processes around what brings you joy. And how do we support those things? How do we make values-based decisions? We can have conversations. Do you want to go to the hospital if you're in distress and need hospital intervention at the end of life? We can talk about medication. We can talk about different alternatives. Do you want to exercise your right to voluntarily stop eating and drinking? But we can also talk a lot about what is it that really matters to you, that defines you as a human, and how do we make sure that those things continue to be nourished, continue to show up as you go through whatever your dying process is going to look like.
So in that vein, you had mentioned before that you quote, like helping people achieve goals they might not have even considered. And I'm curious what you meant by that. And in terms of do you have any concrete examples of, without breaching any confidentiality, of helping someone find a goal that they might not have considered without your assistance?
Nothing, because it sounds a little pretentious, but I think that what I mean by that is again, the way that we're presented with thinking about end of life choices tends to be, do you want this type of medical intervention? Do you want this? Or even if it gets a little bit beyond that, we think about, what kind of music would you like to have playing in the background? And all of these things are really necessary and important things to consider. But what we're not necessarily considering is sort of the whys behind those choices. So a great concrete example I can give you without breaking confidentiality, because of the number of people that have said this to me, which is, the second I need somebody to help me go to the bathroom, just take me out back and shoot me. And and there's so much to unpack in terms of the cultural ableism and all of this, again, and independence and autonomy that's built into our sense of self. I don't necessarily do that work with individuals, especially not those that are immediately at the end of life. But I think that it's worth keeping in mind that this is something that people have a real fear about. And so for me, that's beginning to, what that would look like is unpacking that. What is it about needing care around toileting that makes you feel like less of a human? It's not ever going to bring somebody joy to need help going to the bathroom. I mean, but there are ways that we can make that seem like a less scary thing. Certainly, try and normalize it. There are so many people that already live incredibly productive and full and meaningful lives that need help going to the bathroom. It is not in any way a definition of your capability or your worth or your value as a human. Is it an adjustment for people that haven't had to have that process throughout their lives? Absolutely. One great way to connect with people around that is people who have been involved with caring for children. Because you get through this process of, oh, changing a diaper isn't a big deal when it's a kid. So why is it going to be a big deal if this is something, if you need an incontinence assistance product as an adult? Why is this, such a big deal? And so there's ways to kind of connect back to what is it that people are really afraid of. And really what that comes down to for so many people is the sense of not feeling valued and feeling helpless. And from there, we can start to move into a positive direction, which is that if people really have fears about being helpless, a lot of it is because they put a lot of stock in what they give back to the people who care for them. And so how do we continue to help them feel as though they are still contributing in a meaningful way to the lives of the people that are caring for them? So that's sort of what that looks like in that process.
I find that to be a very interesting example, especially in part of my line of work is working in a nursing home and helping people either regain those skills or getting to a place where people know, where staff knows how to properly manage people's bathroom and toileting needs and bathing and other such things. But the being a male practitioner, I will often get some older woman saying, "Well, in my generation, that's having a male work with me is just not something I would consider." And I say, you are absolutely willing to have female work with you instead of a man, but just so you know, it seems to be more related to in my observation, I don't always tell them this, but it seems to be way less related to the age or the gender of the person and way more related to how many times they've been in the hospital before.
Yeah.
The people who are old hat with it, they just don't care. They're like, yeah, sure, we'll chat. You want to read me a book while we're on it? Want to invite your friend in? They just don't care. And then, and then the people who are more modest about it usually, of course, there's cultural components too, but
Yes.
usually this is their first time having this be an issue. But how quickly it becomes not an issue for people, I find interesting. I mean, I've spent a disproportionate amount of my day standing in the bathroom while someone's sitting on the toilet.
Yep.
uh,
And yeah, and it's one of those things that, again, we just, for the most part, the majority of people that live in the US, that's not a common experience until they've experienced some sort of illness or, are at the end of their life. And it seems horrific. And I'm not arguing for destigmatizing going to the bathroom by saying we should take all the doors off of, toilets in our homes or public places or anything like that.
Nor am I, for sure.
But it is something to be said that, it really isn't that big a deal. You're not being judged for this. It reminds me too that we had a conversation at one point where the other thing that people really struggle with is changes in mobility. Ability to walk, especially here in Vermont, right, where so many people are so super active and moving around. And so people have a lot of fears around changes in mobility and not being able to walk the way that they used to. And one of the things that I love that you do is you help people, because one of the things that we know, right, is the more afraid you are of falling, the more likely you're going to go through postural changes that is going to make it more likely for you to fall, right? So you work with people, helping people learn to fall, right? And sort of taking that fear away and how to fall safely if you are going to fall. And there's these wonderful integrations between what we can do on a practical level, and including like taking up area rugs and making sure you don't have, cords stretched across things like that. But also like inviting mobility aids in. And this is the same way, if you do need to use a cane or a walker, you're not less of a human. That there are still paths and trails that you can go out and move around if you need assistance with your mobility. And also that, to really start to think about what does it mean? Why do you value moving in this way? Is it really your ability to move your own two legs in a coordinated pattern and locomote in that way? Or is it being outside in nature? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And it's, to really to begin to unpack those things, I think helps people understand why they have the reaction that they do, which is really valid whenever something's going to change in a big way. and also is really important to say, oh, this is a reaction. This is my, because it's new. I've never had to deal with this. And so it feels weird and scary and perhaps even demeaning. And again, it's something that you can get used to and practice. And especially, I think that process of getting used to and adjusting and adapting is so much easier when you understand, oh, it's not really about moving my own two legs. It's about being able to get out and be in the woods, or to, go out with my dog, or, meet my neighbor for tea. And, I don't necessarily need to do that on my own two legs to have that experience and have that experience be valuable to me.
Yeah, I certain, certainly agree with that. And the for me, I tend to be, how do we earlier in life be thinking about how do we actually gain the resilience to manage. So not that I tell someone not to use a cane when they would benefit from one, but I try to make sure that people, for one, may have a properly heighted cane or maybe a walking stick instead, or hiking poles.
Yeah,
And
hiking poles.
yes, I think hiking poles are great.
Yeah.
And to speak to the fall piece, like, it's the idea of my graduate research was on fall training and whether or not learning how to fall instead of just being afraid of falling could actually help. And like most research things that are that are out there, the my true the I would like to say that yes, it can be, and I think that clinically speaking, that I can, in good conscience, be helping people learn how to fall. The research is still out on it because there haven't been good longitudinal studies on fall training and then, like, people's ability to have the post impacts years later. But
Right.
um, I want to work with people and not go into become a researcher in that respect. But
Right.
yeah, so the getting people comfortable with, like life keeps changing.
Yep.
Like, yeah, and how do we make sure that we're resilient enough to and have the supports? And that's part of resilience, is really having the supports. One of the things I'm hearing from you is you can help people navigate those supports and think about, what is your actual goal? Is your goal to walk, or is it sitting, or is your goal to be able to get outside when you want to? Those are two different things. If you could walk but you couldn't go outside, that might be worse.
Right. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you had any advice or closing thoughts.
I think that a really nice segue from this is that, there are no discrete events. We live life in this continuum. Life itself is messy, right? And so I think that a lot of times, especially when I talk about green burial, so this is a funny story. I usually start my green burial talks by talking a little bit about, thank you for coming. A lot of people approach green burial from an environmental perspective. We're thinking about what can we do for the environment, but we are going to be talking about dead bodies, and it's often hard to talk about dead bodies without starting to think about our own death. And I give people permission to have an emotional reaction to that. And if they need to get up for a moment or take a moment or leave the room, whatever that's going to look like, that's okay with me. Um, and I usually end that by saying, because the fact of the matter is, we're all going to die. And I was giving a green burial talk and I said that, and there was a voice from the back of the room that said, well, what a terrible thing to say. And that is just always stuck with me, because I think it's like, well, and I really wish I'd had a great response to that in the moment. I've thought so often about what I should have said. And I think I just sort of blinked and went on with my talk. But I think that this is the idea, is that people want, I don't necessarily want, maybe isn't the right word there, but this is a practice in coming into relationship with our mortality, which again, I believe, should start in early childhood and continue throughout our lives. We can't just think about when we die, how do we want to be buried, without thinking about the fact that we are going to die. And for the most part, if we're lucky, dying is going to come at the end of a process of aging, which is also going to contain a series of changes in how we're able to be and interact and communicate in the world. Sometimes death comes very unexpectedly from an accident or some sort of tragedy. But for, even then, it's really important to understand that it's going to come in the midst of life. Death is not the other side of life. It is very much a part of who we are. We carry our mortality with us every single day. And so what does it mean to start to think about our life as not a series of discrete events? It's like, oh, now I'm in the summer of my life and I am doing these things, and I'm, climbing the corporate ladder, and, or buying, working to buy a house, or whatever it is that has, a meaning of sort of this, like, where we're at in life between our 30s and our 50s. But also that means that, we are eventually, hopefully, if we're lucky, going to be 50. And when we're 50, we're going to be facing sort of different changes. And it's all work that we can continually be thinking about in a broader perspective of, oh, like, this whole time, my whole life, I'm a mortal being. And we can't run around thinking about, go to the grocery store and be like, one day I am going to die. Therefore, which brand of frozen pizza I pick out tonight is really going to, we can't carry it that way. It's impossible to. But I think it is really important to just sort of check in every now and then and remember, oh, we are going to die. Is it really important what I'm doing right now? And when I talk about values and this idea and the privilege that people have given me to work with them and build these values-based advanced care plans for their own dying, the number of times people bring that back into what they're doing in their life right now, that is the best and the most rewarding part, because that is what I really would love people to be doing, is to think about, if these are things that are going to matter to me, if having a green burial, having minimal environmental impact and maximal environmental benefit in the way that I'm buried is important to me, what else can I do that's good for the environment while I'm alive? If it's really important to me to be surrounded by loved ones when I die, what can I do to maybe have more conversations with them right now, tomorrow? And those sorts of things, and to just always remember that, this is going to sound incredibly precious, but life is a gift, and that it's not easy. I don't mean to say that it's something that should be celebrated, because sometimes it's really, really, really hard. And we're faced with extraordinary challenges, and we're faced with extraordinary challenging times. We are certainly not treated equally in life, depending on who we are and what we look like and where we come from and what our first language is, all of these things. I don't in any way want to gloss over that. But the fact of the matter is that we are all mortal, and that we can, I think, live deeper and more richer lives for thinking a little bit about not what it means to be mortal in terms of, oh, I'm going to die. And there are certainly people in the United States that are very, very aware of that on a daily basis. Leaving their home is a confrontation with the fact that they are, at a greater risk of dying than other Americans, especially when we think about skin color for Black Americans. But I think that beyond that sense of I'm going to die is that sense of, so what matters to me in order to live well? This is the day that I have. This is the morning I have. This is the hour, the moment. What can I do to bring joy to myself in this moment? And I think that, again, it sounds a little bit precious, but we live a little bit more deeply connected to ourselves, and then hopefully from there to the people that we care about and to our broader communities. And so that, I think, is the piece that I want people to think about, is that my work, while it is absolutely that word death, that's what I do, is so much about living and how we live well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really
Well,
appreciate your time.
yeah. Thank you so, so much for having me. And this has been an honor. And it's always great to have an opportunity to talk about what I do to people that are interested in hearing about it. So thank you.
In this show, I really enjoy showcasing a variety of different perspectives and having conversations with people that we wouldn't about health that we wouldn't ordinarily have. I really enjoyed being able to talk about death in this episode, which is such a taboo topic and seems in some ways the opposite of health and life, but really is sort of integrated in with and is conversations worth having. If you enjoyed this show, and I hope you did, if you could leave a review on the podcatcher of your choice and share it with a friend, that'd be very much appreciated. You've been listening to Resilience Radio. Take care.